really to get anybody to react to it. You know, I'm so girl. What's her name?
Danielle?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah, they have one in American history as well.
Oh, really?
That people don't really use it because I think they're afraid of coming back on them or something, or I don't know what it is. Sometimes I like to put in kind of an inflammatory remark, especially with the Americans. So
Yeah.
Does disturb people up, really? To get them to react, it's difficult.
I guess maybe people are self-conscious as well.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, to a certain extent, yeah.
But anyway, sure. If you go terrible amazing mistakes, just a stupid thing, so
exactly.
At the end of the word.
What am I doing here? All right, there we go. Look at this, right.
Response this week wasn't.
Wasn't an awful lot to say, really.
Yeah.
So
And like you say, I'm still feeling, I feel like Danielle like really covered what she could add in. Sometimes like I don't want to just try and make stuff up
For the sake of making stuff up,
Yeah.
she did very comprehensively come up with a list of. Now she did come up with a list of things to add to the. Which one was it? Thornton, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was another one, somebody further down, I had these marked on the iPad, talked about adding ethnicity.
Yeah, Kieran.
Yeah, talked about adding ethnicity as another one to it. But yeah, that and was there anybody else? Did John say something about adding something? I can't remember, or was that somewhere else?
I have one info on that about Thursday night.
No problem. It is because there's not a lot. They're not actually the most exciting articles in the world. There is now a couple of things come to mind with them. One of the things that comes to mind about the Thornton one is, and he has examples in it, part of the problem that I have with Thornton is that he conceives of each reference to somebody as a single piece of data, as it were. So he imagines, Thornton, here we go, that when you look at the examples that he has down here somewhere, he imagines that each of these name references, that this is one piece of information. And so he tries to create a table, and he's got a description of it down here, where he takes the forename, the nickname, the father, the godfather, all of the grandfather, all of these in one thing. So he makes one big table out of all of it. But actually, and it's a pity in the example he picks, he only has, the longest name he has is like Brian McKennetig, because you could have instances where the name was Brian Mock whatever. And in fact, that's not just one, it's one person, but it's not one piece of information, because within that string of names, there's actually a whole series of father-son relationships.
Would it be, I know the Irish names.
Yeah.
It's like a double barn name today.
It is. It's kind of like that. So he's actually not succeeded in breaking it down to its sort of smallest components.
And it is like a kind of a, what you call it, like you have in the Bible where it's so-and-so was son of so-and-so.
Yeah, you get the same thing in Viking names, where it's so-and-so, it's like Olaf Iverson or whatever, and that, and they still have this problem in Iceland because they still use that form of surname. So what was the name of the prime minister? I can't remember, something, but all the women's names end in daughter and all the men's names ends in son, because they use the patronymics still. So presumably they've worked out a way of dealing with this, which obviously a lot of the people trying to turn, I mean, in this case, the annals of Ulster. I think it's the Annals of Ulster, which is part of the Celt project, trying to get the names out of that. Obviously, you know, a lot of people working on this hadn't come up with a better way of doing that. And that's one of the problems. I have a couple of links that point to that. But what about Pelter? It's much more interesting, isn't he? What did people say about Pelter that was exciting or not? Everybody talked about the elitism. I think we can take the elitism as read. Nobody wrote about the small people in history, which is unfortunate. But the way you get at the small people in history, in ancient and medieval history, is through things like archaeological remains. I had to do a database once of somebody who was doing a master's on the non-metric traits of the postcranial skeletons from the Ardfert Cathedral excavations, which basically meant looking for, on the bones below the head, indicators of malnutrition, of disease, of injury, and extracting from that some picture of how they lived, how they died, what they ate. So it's kind of, that's the way you come at those, really. So we can take the elitist stuff as read. What about the other bits of Pelteret? You didn't like Thornton at all, did you? That's fair enough. Yes, well, I might retire these two articles next year, but a couple of people talked about linkages and standards. And the thing about it is these both date from about 2000. So there's not an awful lot. If you search for digital prosography, you don't get an awful lot of stuff on it. But let's go to this one. This, in fact, it's a blog, it's a research project. Standards for networking ancient prosographies. It's based in the UK somewhere, and it's funded. So this is looking at some of the ones that I think Pelteret refers to, the prosography of Anglo-Saxon England and the one of the Byzantine Empire. He refers to both of those, and what these guys have done is they've got funding to come up with a way to deal with this linkage stuff. And it uses a more contemporary way of doing things called RDF, which is Resource Definition Format. And basically what the nub of RDF is that it identifies two things in the relationship between them. Any two things. So anything that has a web address and any other thing, and it works best now that we have ways to create an almost infinite number of web addresses, you can then define an RDF that says, okay, these things are related to this, and this is the nature of the relationship. So there's one here, the example they have, which says this web address, the thing at this web address is a person. So it refers to this almost sort of untypable web address in a German historical archive of medieval texts. And it says that the object that's referenced at this is a person. And it says this was published by that German Archaeological Institute, and that this here, Foaf is friend of a friend, the relationship is that it's this name. Which I presume is Plato, in the German for Plato, but I'm not sure. So that breaks down there as this web address refers to a person according to this sort of academic authority, and it's this person called this, called Platon, and the language German is tagged on there to identify, but it's simpler if you didn't have the language. So if you were using that, someone like the reference to Brian McKinnitig in the Annals of Ulster would have a celt.ucc.ie, hugely long web address, and it would have RDF type, it's a person, and it would have the publisher would be celt.ucc.ie, and this would be here it would have Brian McKinney in there, and it might have language, it might have GA for the language for Gaelic. And that allows you to identify, now it depends on a couple of things. It depends on a whole bunch of things which are defined and the definitions are stored elsewhere. So, is that the one? I didn't read that one. I read this one. This is a Brutus. So this is the record for Decius Junius Brutus. And this depends on whatever you're manipulating the data with, being able to find all these definitions on the web. So the definition of the friend of a friend, which defines relationships, is stored online at xmlnamespaces.com. And that's the version of the standard that's there, that's referenced in this. This is, I can't remember what that is. This is the RDF standard, which is at the w3.org website. And it says 1999 is the date, and it's the reference syntax for RDF, which means that any program that wants to resolve the information down here, that wants to work out what does this mean? What does RDF type load attestation mean? Goes back to the header of the document and says, right, where's the RDF stuff? The RDF stuff is here. And this, which I think is for interchange of ancient and medieval prosography, it can reference, it can find these two and it can say, what do these terms mean? So you don't have to repeat the terminology in the header of the document. You just say, go up there on the web and there's the document that defines what these mean. And it means that anybody, anywhere in the world can use these. There's the RDF schema reference. And some parts of this are not, are really only intelligible to computer scientists. And some make sense to ordinary people. So here, for example, there is somewhere here, there is a reference where he's associated, there's an associated place, and it is this. That's a collection of ancient Greek texts, and obviously they've got a list of place names, and it refers to Cisalpine Gaul as that place name number in the list. So you can hike off and say, what is this? Well, we go to there, we look up the list of places, and it's Cisalpine Gaul. And that's standard. So if anybody wants to tag anybody else as being in Cisalpine Gaul at any point in time, assuming you can agree on the borders of it, then you just use that place name reference and it's there and it's referenceable globally. So it provides that interchange. So you get over the problems of identifying things like counties and kingdoms and abbeys and stuff like that, once you give everything a centrally referenced thing. A lot of the web works like this now. A lot of it works on the basis that there are standard definitions stored somewhere online, and you just use those as a standard vocabulary to reference things. So that's what this Snapdragon project is doing. It's trying to actually come up with a set of a header that will meet the needs of what they need to do without having to recreate any of it. Does that make any sense? It's like having an online phone book and just making the whole thing transparent and binding it together in the front end that you don't see all the back end architecture. Do I have? No, I don't. Let me find this. No, okay, let's try that again. I gotta type it longer. Ah, here it is, okay. People. Anybody by name. Try and find people for whom there are more than one Adalbert. So this gives you a list of the results of people. Pick Adalbert number 3, whoever he is. And it puts up all the bits in the text they've identified which relate to this particular individual. So if we go and pick, actually, so there we are, and it goes boom. And it doesn't, actually, it just tells you about the source information in this case. Oh, it's about coins, right. So it's a reference to him in something about coins, but since he's referred to as an abbot and a moneyer, then maybe it is, and then it kicks you out to there, which is perhaps not so helpful. But that's kind of it in action, where they've actually collected it all together, and so they've got a whole bunch of different sources, almost all the texts that exist online about Anglo-Saxon England, and they've started to overlay this umbrella on them to bring them all together in a front end like this that looks reasonably easy to use. And presumably, if you were familiar with Anglo-Saxon England and you were familiar with the history of it and those names made sense and you knew those sources, then that would all be a little bit Spartan and not very exciting as a design, but it would give you what you needed. And you could probably run more complicated queries against it to pull out. Somebody suggested if there's records of deaths, you could pull out the death dates and ages of everybody, or their birth and death date, and subtract one from the other, and come up with mean ages for, or lifespans for people in that corpus. The same with the Byzantine one, which I don't know if it's online or not. I'm not even going to look for it. But that's basically, I mean, the most useful thing about those two articles is that they were written 15 years ago now, and they're kind of struggling. And it's still not entirely smooth and easy, but it is possible to see how things have come on over the past 15 years in terms of linking things together and developing standards. So that's about the most interesting thing about those. Did anybody else have any sort of questions or thoughts on those? Where's the thread? Or is prosography all very boring? Yeah, the question of again, Danielle talked about archaic terms is another one, glossaries of archaic terms which change over time. Funding.
That seems to be a never-ending problem in all the articles, isn't it?
It is. It takes a lot of time and effort to get this stuff keyed in. A great deal of it is done by PhD research slaves. Basically, you get a funded PhD, and as part of it, you spend 2 years of it typing in lots of data, and then you get to analyze it. And that there's two things about that. One is, and the sort of Snapdragon blog brings it home, that a great deal of this is collaborative and open. So it used to be that you hid away and you did your research and then you produced it and that was it, and it was published subsequently. Now, one of the requirements, there's a number of requirements of funding, and one is dissemination. Stuff has to be public and reusable. And that tends to drive a process whereby people are much more comfortable about writing about work in progress as they go along, which is interesting. And yeah, there's their current summary at the end of the first year, where they talk about, they've got a list of all the ancient people coming together and what they've achieved, basically. It's kind of a rough version of their annual report put out there in a digestible form for people to see. So that's one of the implications of funding. Well, there's two. One is the publicity, and the other is that it has to be based on collaboration. There's no way. One of the things about like Thornton and Pelteret and people like that is that they were trying to work on their own. And therefore, the amount of work that had to be done was too much, so it never got finished. So there's an awareness of research projects now will last longer than the researchers. Somebody will set up a project and it'll be worked at for 4 or 5 years, and then there'll be another tranche of funding to carry it on for the next bit, and one bunch of researchers will finish up and go away and more will come in. So that's one thing. The downside of the funding issue is people in the UK are very worried that universities' research purposes are becoming project hotels, in that you are only as good as your last funded project, and you have to go out there and get funding for the next 4-year project. And a lot of early career academics are mostly researchers rather than teachers, and they get contracts in the universities for the duration of the research project. So, and then at the end of, whatever, 3.5 years, you've got to turn around and find another source of funding for the next bunch of the research project. Otherwise, you're likely to be out on your ear. So that is
Sorry, wouldn't that be applicable as well to science?
yes.
I remember years ago having friends on funded projects for about 4 years in, say, botany and physics or something like that, under physics, right? And they went and they worked for 4 years on this project, and then they gave out the result. They were government funded, and they had to give out